today's video, we're going to continue the arrow building series, and we're going to talk about arrow points today. The differences of arrow points as far as what they're made of, the different shapes and sizes and weights, what they do, some benefits and drawbacks to each, and ultimately just some good information about arrow points. For those of you that are new here, my name is Jake Kaminsky. I'm a two-time Olympic silver medalist in the sport of archery. We're going to make this channel a great resource to all types of archery. So if you haven't yet, hit that subscription button and the notification bell. That way you're notified every time I upload a new video. Just producing a lot of content to help make you a better archer. Okay, so I'm continuing the arrow building series, and we're going to talk about points today. So if you haven't seen the rest of the series yet, there'll be a link in the description below, plus a card at the top here on where you can find the series itself. The majority of what the arrow point is doing and controlling is how stiff or weak the arrow reacts. So in general, I've already covered this in my tuning series, so if you haven't seen that yet, there's a link in the description below to the actual tuning series on how to tune up your Olympic style recurve bow. So essentially, what an arrow point does is breaks down the spine of the arrow. Not actually breaks the arrow, but what it does is it makes the arrow stiffer or weaker depending on the weight of the arrow. A general rule of thumb, which holds true for everything, is a heavier point makes the arrow weaker. That means the arrow will then bend more. Basically, it's because the weight in the front of the arrow resists movement while the bow is pushing the arrow forward, so the arrow will then bend more when there is more mass weight up front. Now, there are different styles and shapes. The two basic shape differences is going to be between your standard parabolic point, like this one, and then your pro point or your pin point, this one. Essentially, the difference between these two styles is this is your standard point. This is generally an aftermarket upgrade, more for indoor style shooting, more for 3D style archery. The theory is once you have a hole in the 10 ring, this little needle point will grab that edge and want to pull it towards the center and get you more 10s. Or if there's an arrow in its way, it's going to not want to glance off to the side because you don't have a very blunt point. It's a bit more sharp and it helps push that other arrow out of the way as the arrow is going into the target. Just your general rule of thumb between the two. Now, once you get past the screw-in points, pretty much everything is glue-in. And when you're gluing in your points, you use hot melt and glue them in. I've already covered how to do that. If you haven't seen that video, it's in the arrow building series, so check that one out. But generally, you have break-offs. And so you can snap off these little segments here, and you can break it off from a 120 grain point to 110 grain point or 100 grain point, depending on how many you do or do not break off. Again, just to affect the tune of the arrow, basically. And the same goes true for just about every arrow or point. You can see these have segments that you can cut off, and some of the arrows that I shoot I've already cut off. The main difference in this video that we're going to cover is the difference between stainless steel, tool steel, and tungsten points. Why is tungsten so much more expensive? Are there really benefits to them? And what do I think about them? So essentially, you can see the main difference in the difference of tungsten and stainless in these 2 points here. The long one is stainless and the short one is tungsten. These are from Nano Pro arrows from Carbon Express. So this one's actually tool steel, which is already heavier than stainless steel, and this is tungsten. Tungsten is almost 2 times more dense than stainless points. So that means you can have the same 100 grain point in half the size of a package. Now, the reason that it's more expensive is because tungsten is extremely dense. It's very expensive to machine because it really wears out tooling. And so they have to recoup the tooling costs, which is a high amount of money, somewhere, and they just increase the price of the point itself because they damage a lot of tooling when they're machining these tungsten points. The difference between this point, you can see it's very long, and this point, which is very short, is that this is stainless and this is tungsten. 2 times the density of this. So the external piece is longer, but also the internal piece is much, much longer. This tungsten insert, the shank of the point where you glue into the shaft, is very, very short. It's just about 1 inch long. Whereas the stainless shank is this long. It's almost 3 inches long for the same weight of point. And what this is doing is essentially it's making this part of the arrow not flex at all. Whereas if you had this tungsten point in there, you have this much more arrow that will be flexing. So dynamically, a 100 grain tungsten point compared to a 100 grain stainless point, the tungsten point will act weaker due to the arrow, more of the arrow shaft flexing. Now, you do have some extra point length here, so you're going to basically be increasing the mass weight outside of the shaft. So in a way that this is heavier out in the front due to the length of it or the center of mass of it. So you do negate some of that effect of gaining more of an arrow flex as far as the dynamic performance goes. But when you also shorten the actual external point, you can then make the arrow shaft itself longer, so it then exaggerates that effect even more so. It has a bit of an effect on FOC, which is front of center balance, which we'll cover in another video. Sneak peek and a little teaser clip to that one is it doesn't matter in my opinion, unless you're shooting very radical arrows that are not standard builds like this one here. FOC is just something you don't necessarily really need to worry about in my opinion. We'll cover that later in another video, but essentially that's the difference in arrow points. The difference between stainless and tungsten, tool steel, the pro points, the standard points, whatever. The points aren't very different. They're pretty much all the same. Slight differences in some. Again, the pro points help push the arrows out of the way so your arrow impacts and it won't deflect out so far. You won't lose as many points potentially. And the tungsten point is more dense. Therefore, the arrow will act a bit more dynamically weaker. Another benefit to tungsten points is they are super heavy duty. So because you have twice as much density in the actual point, that means you have twice as much resistance to actual dinging and damage to the point tip itself. I've seen people shoot concrete walls with a tungsten point, not bend the point, and basically get their arrow, blow the dust off of it, and it's perfectly fine. It's, at least the point is, not the rest of the arrow. So they can reuse that point. So for me, especially when I started traveling overseas and shooting indoor tournaments and things like that and shooting into different target bales, I found that I needed to have tungsten points because some of the bales that are out there are so dense and so hard that I would ding and bend my stainless points in some of the bales out there. So if you're having issues with bending your point tips, dinging them up really bad, tungsten points are going to resist that type of abrasion and wear a lot better than your stainless style points are. Something to also consider is that tungsten can be more brittle than stainless can be as far as the actual flexibility is concerned. And the X10 arrow, they did a specific blend of tungsten and other alloys so that it's not brittle, the points don't just break off. I have heard that in some of the Carbon Express arrows, like those Nano Pros, the stainless points will break off if they hit a really hard bale or you hit the wall with them. I've never seen that myself. I haven't actually shot them enough to even really tell you my opinion between the two, but I've heard that a lot of the top shooters prefer the tool steel and the nanos over the stainless or the tungsten points. But as far as X10s go, tungsten is really the only way to go in my opinion. Tungsten 100 grains. I've already covered that in some of my other tuning series videos. But if you ask me, flat out, the best shooting arrow setup that I have ever used is an X10 with a 100 grain tungsten point. I do have a book that we're working on getting the rest of pre-sales out and still taking orders that I will be signing and sending to everybody. Tuning for Performance. If you haven't seen that yet and check that out, there's links in the description below. Plus, I'll put another card at the top here on where you can find this book on my website as well as Amazon. And I appreciate everybody that's had the patience of during our pre-orders because we've had a lot of orders and a bit of a headache with PayPal. That's all solved by now. So thanks for everyone for your patience and for your orders. I appreciate it. Thanks for watching, and thank you to my Patreon supporters. If you want to become a Patreon supporter or check out books, apparel, and some seminar info, head to jkaminsky.com and be sure to hit that subscribe button and the notification bell to be notified every time a new video is uploaded. And I appreciate you watching. Thank you again.